Hey everyone, welcome to week 32. This is day one. This is the first day of our ongoing week of what is going to be primary color week. We're going to use yellow, red, and blue. Our palette for today, because we're going to change it throughout the week, is going to be titanium white, bismuth yellow, cad red, and cobalt ultramarine. So we're going to see how we do today. For this week, we're going to go back to very formal qualities of painting. We have been concentrating on the ideas behind the painting, on the stance we can take when we paint, on identifying our intentions before we paint, and trying to execute a painting so that we can get close to those intentions. And that, I feel, and I've always felt, that is the most important part of painting. The fact that you know how your perception is shaped, you know why you see things in a certain way, and you understand the events that have shaped that perception, the way we were brought up, the beliefs that we had in our households, traumatic experiences that we may have had, joyful experiences that we may have had. There are so many variables, some of them incredibly happy and others that are very, very painful. But all those experiences, good and bad, all those moments in our life, moments that we want to cherish, moments that we want to forget, those have tainted us in a way. Those have shaped the way we have constructed our perception, the way we see things. So for me, I've always felt that we don't have to have an ability that is only attainable through working insanely hard at the beginning of our formal training. I believe that because I have been moved to tears by artists' work that shows no evidence of how we traditionally and classically formally define ability. The first time that I was moved by something that didn't exhibit any quality that I thought was inherent to being a competent artist was when I realized, we don't really need this. We just have to be intelligent about the tools that we have, the ability that we have, the capacity that we have. We just have to know how to use it and how to channel it and how to put it to work. Knowing how to use it means that we have to understand ourselves. We have to understand how we see things, under what light we see things, and how we can translate that perception into painting. Now, that obviously means that we have to have a relationship with paint. We have to have built a relationship with our tools. There has to be a sense of familiarity there. We can't feel like our tools are foreign. They have to be close to us. And the exercise that we're going to do this week is just so that we can get a little bit closer to our colors. Now, we have worked with a very limited palette. We have worked with what we call a 4-color Zorn palette, which is titanium white, yellow ochre, cad red or vermilion, and ivory black. That has been a very, very traditional palette, and the shorthand way that we can describe it is a Zorn palette. And we all know that he kind of used that palette with a bunch of his paintings, showing us inadvertently that with very little you can do a lot if you use it wisely. But that palette is actually, and I've said this before, echoing a philosophy of painting that was very prevalent in the Renaissance, High Renaissance, and Baroque painting, which essentially kind of spoke about the availability of pigments and how having all these hues was something, of an impossibility. And they had to work with mostly earth hues, so mostly earth tones, and a few colors that had high chroma, and that was about it. But their options were limited. So when we speak about 4-color palettes, especially when we emphasize that we want to work with a Zorn palette, we are trying to tap into that mentality of painting that was prevalent in the 15th, 16th, and 17th century. I know that we have also used a very, very gray 4-color palette where we replace the saturation from the cad red with an earth red. So there was a week where we used titanium white, yellow ochre, Venetian red as a replacement for cad red and or vermilion, and ivory black. So it's a rich earth tone, not a lot of saturation, and very limited hue range. For today, we are actually going to go back to our faithful primary colors, and we are going to use saturation, which is actually a property of color that I am not super keen on. It's not that I can't use saturated colors. I love to use every single property that a color can offer to me, but my own sensibility, and maybe this is part fear, and maybe this is just part me understanding myself as a painter and what I am sensitive towards. My own sensibility is of a painter that gravitates towards the gray, the unsaturated. So whenever I see high saturation in colors, high chroma, I just go like, I don't know, I feel uncomfortable. But this week, I'm going to show you guys that even though our starting point may be saturated, not super saturated, I know that for me, this is going to be a little bit saturated. There's going to be some people that say, oh, come on, this is cake, this is nothing. Of course, there's going to be more saturated versions of these hues available to all of you guys. If you go to the art store, there's pigments today that are insanely saturated. So I'm not trying to sound like I'm overly proud of myself because I'm using somewhat saturated colors. But again, this is something that doesn't come naturally. But we're going to use them because I always have fun doing these exercises. And I think that it is very, very helpful when I go back to very basic things and I concentrate on that, and it reminds me of the fundamentals of painting. The 4-color palette that we're going to use, this is not a 3-color palette. Don't ever dismiss the white as a color. Remember, white is a pigment and it has properties like every other pigment that we have in our palette. There are different whites that have different temperatures, and they lean towards being warmer or cooler, and maybe you can even call them like yellower or bluer. So always understand titanium white as a color. Don't ever dismiss it. As soon as we dismiss it, as soon as our mind starts not thinking about it as a color, then we create a void. We're never going to understand it wholly. And we have to understand it as a color. So this week's 4-color palette is going to be composed by titanium white. Our yellow is not going to be a yellow ochre like that Zorn palette. It's going to be bismuth yellow. So it's a pretty saturated lemon-ish yellow. So it's a yellow green. Remember, we always say first the hue that's dominant, and then second the hue that it's leaning towards. Kind of think it that way. So first we say yellow because it is a yellow hue. And then we say, where is it leaning towards? Is it leaning towards the green hue in our color wheel? Or is it leaning towards the orange hue in our color wheel? This particular yellow, bismuth yellow, it's a kind of lemon yellow. It's a lemonish yellow. I would say it's greener than a cad lemon yellow. So this one I would still call a yellow green. For my red, I'm going to use cad red. So we've already used cad red before in our Zorn palette. It is a red orange. It's a very, very warm, incredibly saturated red orange. I've always liked it. Some people think it's way too saturated, and they try to use vermilion. Some companies today produce a real Chinese vermilion, traditional vermilion, which is an absolutely gorgeous, gorgeous pigment. But in all honesty, I think it's a little bit too expensive for me. So I am totally fine with the more saturated, less forgiving cadmium red. Now, remember, cad red, it's not good for you. It's a pigment that, honestly, if we can avoid, we should avoid. We have to be super careful when dealing with it. Just wash your hands. Just know that cadmiums, cobalts, all those heavy metals, they're not good. So just be careful when using them. So we're using bismuth yellow, cad red. For our blue hue, I'm going to be super honest. The only reason I'm using this blue is because I found like a super old tube that I had hidden somewhere. And it is Cobalt Ultramarine. So it is cobalt blue with a little bit of ultramarine. These two blues are blue violets, really. I mean, cobalt blue for me is a little hard to describe. I think it is a little bit warmer, a little bit brighter, far more saturated, lighter than ultramarine blue, which is darker, a little bit more transparent, if I would say, and it's very, very cool. So this is like a kind of mix of both. Why am I using a cobalt ultramarine? Because when picking my primary color palette, and this is, I guess, one of the first and very important things, I want to have an extended value range. And what does that mean? That if I don't have my darkest dark available to me in one of these hues, then I'm never going to be able to speak about a value 0. I'm never going to be able to mix colors that are value 0. If you actually think about it, as soon as I want to mix a dark hue that doesn't lean exclusively towards the blue hue, if I want to make a violet, a purple, I'm going to have to add red to that. But here's the thing. Because cat red is actually of a lighter value than our cobalt ultramarine, then if we want to make a dark that is not a blue hue, that dark is going to immediately be lighter because that lightness in that cat red is going to have an incidence in the value that is being mixed for that dark. So it's going to be a very tricky palette because our darks are going to suffer a little bit. I don't want to paint bluish, purplish darks all the time. Sometimes I want them to be a little bit earthier, but trying to mix an earthier tone with primary colors is difficult because we have to sacrifice value. We're going to have to mix some of that yellow into our red and blue mix. And by mixing that yellow, because bismuth yellow is not really transparent, it actually has some opacity and some body to it. Again, it's going to have some incidence in our mixture and it's going to make it lighter. So we have to be very, very mindful of those things when we play around. So for today, those are going to be our 4 colors: titanium white, bismuth yellow, cad red, and cobalt ultramarine blue. Throughout this week, I am going to see if I make a change maybe during one of these days. I want to try a color I just bought. I've been using it in the past couple of weeks, but I want to see how it behaves as my sole red hue. Maybe we'll do that tomorrow. And the color I'm referring to is quinacridone magenta. I've never used magentas in my palette, so it's actually really nice to experiment and to see how it's going to behave as my sole red hue. Now, technically, I'm also going to be working on an unprimed paper, so colors are going to shift a little bit. I'm pretty sure that if you're not used to painting, that is going to be something that's frustrating. I would ask people that if this is the first time you're painting, just prime your surfaces, just seal your surfaces so that you're not sacrificing one of the natural qualities of painting in oils, the handling of paint. I actually like it. I like how the surface just really absorbs a lot of the oil in paint. I love that the value is sacrificed. It actually shortens the value scale. The contrast that we perceive in that final image is far more limited to the one that's available to us when we start painting. Those are choices that I'm making, and I would just advise people that painting behaves in a very, very different way when you are making the decisions that I'm making, just working on a raw surface. Again, I actually love it, and I made this decision a couple of weeks ago when I realized how much closer I got to the feeling of the painting that I wanted to achieve, that I wanted to always strive for. So I'm doing that. I'm not saying that I'm never going to work on primed surfaces again. Obviously, I will, but I'm just having a blast just getting to know the surface and really trying to forge a relationship with it and seeing how my paints behave and how it actually affects my decision making while I'm painting just by having this raw surface. One very important thing to know about using a primary color palette is that the most important choice that you can make is which colors are you going to choose, which pigments are you going to choose to represent your primary color hues. That is your first choice, and that is huge. That can actually make a world of a difference because today's palette, bismuth yellow, cad red, cobalt ultramarine blue, and titanium white, would be vastly different from, let's pick 3 different primary color pigments. We can pick cad yellow, and we can pick alizarin crimson, and cerulean blue. So those 2 primary color palettes would be insanely different. I mean, completely different. We can try really, really hard to make them look alike, but inherently they would do very, very different things. So we have to be conscious of that when we are picking a primary color palette. We are not trying to say, okay, this is going to be the universal yellow, this is going to be the universal red and the universal blue. But what we're going to try to do is just reflect upon our color choices and say, okay, what's available to me? I have a yellow green that's saturated. It has some body to it. It has some opacity to it. I have a very opaque cad red, which is highly saturated, and it's a red-orange, very, very warm. And I have a Cobalt Ultramarine, which is still, despite of the Cobalt, it's still a very cool color. It has some of the brightness, some of the saturation of the Cobalt, but it still leans towards the blue-violet side. So that is what my palette looks like. If you couple that with the coolness and the opaqueness of titanium white, that palette has a character. And that's the most important thing to identify. When you're working with primary colors, your goal is not just to say, oh, I can make any color from primary colors. That's rubbish. That's nonsense. That sort of stuff just doesn't matter. And the quick answer is no, you can't make any pigment from 3 primary colors. There's always going to be an earth, tone, or there's always going to be some weird teal color that you're never going to have access to. That's just the way it is. For me, it's always been like purples and violets. Oh my God, those are almost impossible to mix. You almost have to have like a violet or a purple pigment. So no, we can't literally mix every single pigment under the sun with just 3 primary colors in white. That is insane. But what we can do is paint. We can obviously paint with them. It should never ever stop us. Even though we can't have access to earthly neutrals, or actually true neutrals if you really think about it, because there's always going to be some hue to our grays. They're always going to have some chroma. We're never going to be able to achieve like true neutrals. So we have to just reflect upon our palette, recognize what its properties are, and then say, okay, what can I do with my palette? What can't I do with my palette? Never, ever concentrate on the things that you can't do with your palette. If that's all you're going to see with your primary color palette, then you're always going to be frustrated. Then it's always going to seem like it's not enough, and it's going to seem like a stupid palette. Like you can't do anything with it. This is just a palette that starts from saturation, but I'm never going to be able to control it and have subtlety with it. And that's not true. We can. We're always going to have choices in terms of what type of grays we can actually achieve. And they all have to do with mixing complementaries. And this is going to be like the core of our mixing practice throughout the whole of our painting session. What does that mean? If we feel something is too red, we're just going to take that yellow and that blue, mix it green, and put some of that green into that red, and that is going to gray it out. If we feel that yellow is a little too saturated, like what do? You take a little bit of that red, mix it with that blue, you make like a violet, and you mix it with your yellow, and that's going to gray it out. So it's all going to be about understanding the use of the complementaries. The most basic but most important thing to know, just add the complementary color so that you can gray out your color a little bit. It is always going to have like a hint of that other color. During that week that we spoke about complementaries, we realized how hard it is to really say, wow, I found 2 perfect complementary colors. By perfect, I mean that when you mix the 2 of them, they create a perfectly neutral gray. And that's something that's tough to do. That's something that's very, very tough to find. It's not impossible to find, but it is something that's pretty hard to find. So with these sorts of palettes, when we're just saying, yeah, for a yellow, I'm going to pick this pigment, for a red, I'm going to pick this pigment, and for a blue, this pigment, we are not certain that the complementaries are going to create a perfectly neutral gray mix. There's always going to be a trace of those colors. If you have red and green, it's always going to be a reddish gray or a greenish gray. If you have yellow and purple, it's always going to be like a yellowish gray or a purplish gray. If you have orange and blue, it's always going to be an orangish gray or a bluish gray. So there's always going to be a tiny little bit of a hint to that grayness, but which is very nice. It actually makes us deal with hue and with understanding that there is a little bit of saturation to that grayness, and we can actually use that. Now, having said that, the character of the way in which I mix is this one. And I'm going to describe it super, super simply. And for some of you guys that saw me mix paint during the Earth 4-color palette week, you know that what I mix is puddles. I mix puddles of paint, and I probably dirty them up a ton. So they all start to behave like grayish puddles that kind of lean towards very specific hues. But that's what I love. I love midtones. I love grayness. So this is where I feel most comfortable. Why do I mix puddles? Because I basically just start mixing 2 or 3 colors. And then, as I just described, if I feel I have to make that puddle kind of lean towards one direction, I slowly add the color that I think is needed to make something a little bit grayer or greener or redder. I understand my palette not as a place where I mix single beautiful flat color mixes. No, I've never seen it as that. I see it as a place where I create relationships, where right from the start, I understand that everything in painting is about relationships, is about how does one mix relate to the other. So if it is all relative in our paintings, then I have to have a ton of variables in my palette where I can say, this is a little bit of paint where I'm painting something that's cooler. This is a little bit of paint where I'm painting something warmer. This is lighter. But here is where we have to do the emphasis. I'm not saying light. I'm not saying dark. I'm not saying blue. I'm not saying red. No, I'm saying lighter. I'm saying warmer. I'm saying cooler. So it's just going to be about those things. It has to be a little bit cooler or a lot cooler. I'm always going to have a point of reference, and then from that reference, I can actually say that needs to be a little bit greener. And instead of just mixing a quote-unquote clean green right next to it, no, I'm just going to shift that puddle into something that's a little bit greener. So that's what I refer to as puddles. Mine get a little dirty. That coupled with the fact that I don't use solvent, so I actually just wipe my brushes with a paper towel. I'm always going to have, in that sense, dirty brushes. But what that enables me to do is to carry on that philosophy of puddle onto my brush. So my brush is going to also behave like a puddle because it's also carrying all these traces of all those other color mixes. What I try to do is have like a brush that I'm going to use for darks, a brush for midtones, a brush for lights. But if I'm being perfectly honest, I don't have the discipline to do that well. And when I start painting, it all goes to hell. And the brush that I used for my darks quickly became the brush that I was using for highlights, and it's a mess. But that's essentially what we're doing. So that was the painting for today. I thought it was a really nice painting. It has a ton of character. That's what I loved about this pose. It has limitations. I understand those limitations. Those limitations are probably heightened by the fact that I'm not using a properly primed surface. So that's actually working, let's say, against me. But I love all those things. I'm actually seeking those things. I'm not complaining about those things at all. So I am, in a way, sacrificing the saturation that I have inherent to my palette because I am deciding to work in an unprimed surface. But again, that's a choice. That's a choice I'm making, and I'm totally fine with it. That was it for today. I hope you guys enjoyed it. Join me tomorrow for Spanish Tuesdays, Martes de Español. Brush up on your Spanish, where I think I'm going to keep 2 of the 3 primary colors, and I'm going to change the red. So we'll see how we do with that new magenta. I hope to see you guys tomorrow. Thank you. Bye.